Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we're travelling far back to a time when the world was still wild, when our ancestors didn't even have a word for disease. This is the story of humanity's first great enemy, the first plague that changed everything. If you enjoy these quiet science stories, tap that like button. It really helps this little channel grow, and I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it on your clock? So, put on your headphones, close your eyes, let's drift together into a time when the earth was young, and the first whispers of sickness began. The world was still young when death learned to travel. Before that, death had always stayed close to where it began, a quiet ending under the open sky, the slow return of flesh to soil. But then, one day, something changed. A new kind of death appeared. One that could walk from one body to another, unseen, unstoppable, and hungry. Humanity had never met a monster like this before. The first plague did not come with thunder or fire. It came with a whisper. It moved in the breath between two people, in a drop of sweat, in a touch. It came not from anger or punishment, but from the smallest forms of life. So small that no one could see them, not even the sharpest eyes or the oldest healers. The people didn't know it, but they were facing an enemy that was alive yet invisible. Long before written history, before kings, before cities, humans lived close to the wild. They hunted, gathered, and moved with the seasons. Their lives were simple, beautiful, and harsh. They shared food, fire, and songs. But they also shared something else, sickness. The world's first plague was born quietly among them. Maybe it began when humans first settled together, staying close for warmth and safety. When we stopped moving, sickness learned how to stay. No one knows exactly which disease came first. Maybe it was smallpox, born from the closeness of humans and animals. Maybe it was measles, learning to live in our blood. Or maybe it was something lost forever, a vanished illness from a vanished world. But what we do know is this. When the first plague came, it changed everything. Imagine a small camp by a river. Smoke rises from a fire. Children laugh as they chase each other across the dirt. Their parents sit nearby, carving tools or cleaning fish. The air is warm. Life feels safe. And then, one night, a child begins to cough. At first, it's just a sound in the dark, but soon the sound spreads. One cough becomes 2, one body becomes 10. The next morning, the camp feels colder. The air is thick with fear. They didn't have a word for plague. They didn't have doctors or medicine. They only knew that something was taking people away, something they couldn't fight or see. Some believed it was a curse from the spirits. Others thought it was the wind. They burned herbs, sang songs, prayed to the sky. But still, the sickness moved from one camp to another, following the scent of life. In the silence of the night, it travelled, through the touch of hands, through the air they breathed, through the closeness that made them human. The same closeness that once kept them safe now made them vulnerable. Love itself became dangerous. When the first plague spread, it didn't just kill bodies, it changed hearts. It taught people fear. It taught them distance. For the first time, humans began to look at each other with suspicion. A friend's cough became a warning, a neighbour's fever became a reason to stay away. The warmth of community turned cold. Still, they tried to understand. Some buried their dead near the river, hoping the water would carry the sickness away. Others burned everything, the huts, the clothes, even the bodies, believing fire could cleanse what they could not see. In a way, they were right. Fire was the first medicine against the unseen. The story of humanity's first plague is also the story of discovery. It's the moment when humans realized that life could be fragile, that something smaller than sight could bring down the strong and silence the brave. This invisible war began long before science could name it, but even then humans began to notice patterns. They saw that sickness moved between people who stayed close. They learned little by little to separate, to isolate, to heal with distance. Maybe that was when fear became part of survival. And maybe, in that fear, wisdom was born. The first plague might have been smallpox. Scientists believe it started thousands of years ago, after humans began to farm and keep animals. In those days, cows, pigs, and chickens lived close to people. Diseases that once belonged only to animals began to cross over, mutating, adapting, learning how to live inside us. One tiny change in a strand of DNA, and suddenly a harmless cow disease became a killer of the humans. That is how smallpox may have begun, a sickness that would one day take hundreds of millions of lives, starting from one invisible leap across species. It's strange to think that something so deadly could begin in such an ordinary way, from a farmer's hand milking a cow, from a cut, a breath, a moment. That's how the history of pandemics always begins, quietly. As centuries passed, humans learned to name what they feared. They carved symbols on stone walls, warning of bad air and cursed winds. In Egypt, ancient priests wrapped their dead carefully, sealing them in cloth. But even mummies have told us stories. Scientists have found traces of smallpox scars on their ancient skin. That means the plague was already here, thousands of years ago, moving through time as we built pyramids, temples, and cities. In Mesopotamia, they called it the hand of a god. In India, it was seen as the fire of wrath. In China, it was a spirit's punishment. Every culture tried to make sense of it, because what else could they do? When something invisible steals breath from your body and warmth from your skin, it feels supernatural. And yet, beneath all the myths, one truth stayed constant. It was nature, not magic. Tiny creatures, viruses, bacteria, waging a war we couldn't see. Even then, humanity refused to give up. We are strange creatures, fragile but stubborn. We kept living, loving and rebuilding, even as sickness returned again and again. Each time it came, it took something from us. A child, a family, a city. But it also left behind something invisible. Knowledge. A small spark of understanding that would one day grow into science. When people first began to notice that some survived, they started asking why. Why did one person live while another died? Why did the sickness return each season? These questions were the first seeds of medicine. Before there were doctors, there were observers, curious eyes watching, remembering, wondering. That curiosity would one day save us. But for now, all they had was hope. The first plague carved scars into our story, and not just on the body, but on the mind. It changed how we built homes, how we buried our dead, how we trusted each other. Fear became part of our bloodline, but so did resilience. For every plague that came, there was always someone who stayed behind, someone who helped, who carried water, who whispered comfort into the dark. Even in the face of death, humans couldn't stop caring. That may be our greatest strength, that even when life is fragile, love refuses to leave. Thousands of years later, when scientists opened ancient tombs and studied old bones, they found the fingerprints of those early plagues in our DNA. Our ancestors had survived, and in doing so they had changed us forever. Each generation carried new defences, new lessons written in their cells. Evolution itself had been our doctor. The cost was heavy, but it gave us endurance. Maybe that's the quiet miracle hidden inside every tragedy, that life always finds a way to keep going. As night fell over the first villages, smoke curled from fires where the living sat in silence. They watched the stars, wondering what gods they had angered. But above them the sky said nothing. The stars simply burned, distant, eternal, watching humanity learn its first hard lesson about the balance between life and death. In that silence, something beautiful happened. We learned empathy. For the first time we understood what it meant to lose together, and to survive together. That was humanity's first plague, not just a disease, but a teacher, a cruel, invisible teacher that showed us how delicate we are and how strong we can be. The healers of the dawn. The world began to change after the first sickness. When the plague came and went, it left behind more than graves. It left questions, soft, quiet questions that lived in the minds of those who survived. Why did it happen? Could it happen again? And most of all, could it be stopped? The people who asked these questions became the first healers. They weren't scientists, not yet. They were observers, mothers, hunters, elders, anyone who noticed patterns in the pain. They learned that some foods gave strength, that clean water healed faster than dirty rivers, that smoke from certain leaves made the air feel safer. It wasn't science as we know it now, it was instinct, born from watching, remembering, and trying to protect the ones they loved. In time, those instincts grew into knowledge. A woman might notice that when she boiled her herbs, fewer people in her family fell sick. A man might see that staying away from a sick friend stopped his own cough from coming. Bit by bit, the first rules of health were written, not on stone or paper, but in memory and habit. It was the dawn of medicine, glowing faintly in a world still half asleep. Villages grew into towns, fires became furnaces, people learned to farm, to trade, to live in groups larger than ever before. But with closeness came danger. The invisible travellers, the viruses, the bacteria, found new roads between us. Markets, rivers, festivals, wars, all became bridges for disease. The plagues had found a new home inside civilization itself. The first great cities were both beautiful and deadly. In the crowded streets of Mesopotamia, people traded gold and grain, but they also traded sickness. Each jar, each handshake, each breath carried risk. Waste flowed into rivers where others drank. Rats and fleas learned to thrive beside us. In the warmth of our progress, new diseases were born. Somewhere in that mix of dust, sweat, and dreams, the plague returned, stronger, sharper, smarter, and yet humanity didn't stop building. Maybe that's what makes us so strange. We build even when we're afraid. We keep reaching for something greater, even when we know it might hurt. In a way, that courage, or maybe that stubbornness, kept our story going. Among the first healers, there were those who believed sickness came from the gods. They prayed to spirits, offered flowers, burned incense, but others began to think differently. They started looking closer, not to the sky, but to the world around them. They saw that sickness often followed dirt, rot, and waste. They noticed that people who lived near clean wells stayed healthier. These quiet discoveries were the first steps toward understanding hygiene. Some healers became respected, even feared. They carried strange tools, stones, bones, carved wood. They mixed roots and honey, wrapped wounds in cloth, and whispered songs over the sick. To the people, they were half magician, half scientist, walking on the border between mystery and truth. And somewhere deep in the heart of Egypt, another step was taken. There, healers became something more, organized. They recorded their knowledge on papyrus, writing down recipes for healing, describing symptoms, and listing herbs. Some of these writings still exist today. The Ebers Papyrus, written more than 3,500 years ago, describes treatments for infections, fevers, and sores. They didn't know about germs, but they knew that cleanliness mattered. They bathed, shaved, and used oils to protect their skin, small acts of defense against invisible enemies. The Nile River carried more than water. It carried ideas. From Egypt, knowledge flowed to Greece, India, China, spreading wisdom the way sickness once had. The balance of the world began to shift. The same closeness that spread disease now began to spread understanding. But every gain had its price. As cities grew, plagues became stronger. One of the earliest known pandemics struck the heart of ancient civilizations. It spread along trade routes, carried by travellers who didn't yet know they were dangerous. In the ruins of old villages, scientists have found traces of smallpox, its marks etched into ancient bones. It means the sickness that once haunted lonely camps by the river had now learned to ride on empires. Imagine the streets of Thebes filled with traders and priests. Somewhere in that crowd, a man begins to sweat. His skin burns, his breath comes shallow. The next day, his neighbour falls. By the end of the week, the marketplace is empty. Priests pray louder, but the gods stay silent. The Nile keeps flowing as if it doesn't notice the fear beside it. The sun still rises. But something has changed, a whisper of helplessness, a quiet knowing that even the mightiest city can fall to something smaller than dust. And yet, through that fear, people kept learning. They began to see that sickness could move along with travellers, soldiers and traders. They started to connect dots. Maybe they thought the disease walks when we do. Maybe it follows our footsteps. And so, in small ways, the idea of quarantine was born. Sailors who returned from long journeys were told to wait outside the city for days before entering. Some waited by the docks, others on small islands. They didn't know about germs, but they knew time could stop sickness from spreading. That small act, waiting, would one day become one of the greatest tools in the fight against disease. In Greece, a man named Hippocrates watched all of this closely. He believed sickness came not from gods or curses, but from nature, from imbalance. He studied patients, their diets, their surroundings. He wrote down everything he saw, searching for patterns. He taught that health was harmony, that disease was disruption. His words were simple but powerful. Let food be thy medicine. Hippocrates didn't know about microbes, but he believed observation could heal, and he was right. That belief became the soul of science. While healers studied the sick, others looked to the stars. In Babylon and India, scholars charted planets and believed the heavens influenced health. In China, doctors spoke of balance, yin and yang, the dance of opposites that kept the body whole. Though their languages were different, their purpose was the same, to understand why humans suffer and how they survive. Even when knowledge was fragile, curiosity burned it bright. But the plagues were not done teaching. As the centuries rolled on, new ones arrived, each darker than the last. They travelled on ships, on trade routes, on the breath of explorers and conquerors. Each one reshaped humanity in its own way. Villages turned into ghost towns. Empires crumbled. Myths grew stronger. Still, the healers kept their fires lit. In every age, there was someone who stayed beside the sick, a mother with cool water, a priest with a prayer, a stranger with a gentle hand. These small acts of kindness were as powerful as any medicine. They didn't stop the plague, but they kept humanity alive, not just in body but in spirit. The first healers had no microscopes or labs, but they had something science would one day call empathy, the courage to care even when afraid. That simple courage carried humanity through its darkest nights. It whispered, "We will learn." And we did. By the time the Roman Empire rose, people had begun to think of disease as something natural, something that could be studied and managed. Roman engineers built aqueducts to bring clean water into cities, sewers to carry waste away. They didn't know they were fighting germs, but they were winning battles against them without even knowing the enemy's name. That was humanity's first true defense, not weapons or prayers, but logic. Still, no defense lasts forever. Every time we thought we had mastered disease, a new one appeared. Each victory was temporary, each cure a brief light in the long dark. But the lights kept coming. That is what makes our story beautiful, that we never stopped trying. As the centuries stretched ahead, humanity would face plagues far greater than the first, plagues that would erase millions, reshape continents, and test everything we believed about life and death. But every time we would rise again, and somewhere deep in that long journey, the whisper of the first healers still echoed, soft and timeless, like a promise passed through generations. Even the smallest hope can survive the greatest sickness. When empires caught a fever, civilization was growing faster than the world could breathe. Cities glittered with marble and fire. Roads stretched like veins across continents. From Greece to Rome, from India to China, humans built wonders that touched the sky. But under all that glory, something ancient was stirring again. Something small, quiet and patient. The plagues were waiting. The first empires believed themselves immortal. They built walls, armies and gods to guard them. But walls could not stop the wind, and armies could not fight what they could not see. In the 5th century before Christ, a city named Athens learned that lesson the hard way. Athens was proud, the heart of art, philosophy and democracy. Its people believed in reason, debate and beauty. But during the long war against Sparta, the city made one mistake. It closed its gates. Everyone rushed inside for safety. The streets grew crowded. The wells ran dry. The air turned heavy. And then, like smoke through cracks, the plague slipped in. No one knows exactly what disease it was. Maybe typhus, maybe smallpox, maybe something lost to time. What we do know comes from a man named Thucydides, a historian who survived it. He wrote that people burned with fever so hot they begged to throw themselves into cold water. Eyes turned red, tongues bled, skin erupted with sores. The strong died first because they refused to rest. The weak followed soon after. Inside the walls there was no escape. Outside the enemy waited with swords. It was as if death had trapped Athens from both sides. Thucydides wrote that people stopped caring for the sick because they feared catching it. Temples filled with bodies. Funerals stopped. The city of wisdom turned into a city of silence. The plague did not just kill people, it killed faith. Some stopped believing in the gods. Others said the gods were punishing them. But perhaps the truth was simpler. The plague didn't choose sides. It only followed the living. And yet, even in that chaos, something changed. Those who survived never caught it again. Thucydides noticed that and wrote it down. Without knowing it, he had just discovered the idea of immunity. The knowledge that once your body fought a disease, it remembered how to fight it again. That small detail, scribbled by candlelight thousands of years ago, would one day save billions. When the war ended, Athens was weaker. Its glory faded. But the story of its sickness lived on, whispered by travellers, remembered by scholars. The plague had taught humanity something cruel and precious. Progress always brings new risks. Centuries passed. Empires rose, fell, and rose again. Rome came next, vast, shining, and unstoppable. Roads connected every corner of its land. Ships carried food, soldiers, and dreams across the sea. But with trade came travellers, and with travellers came disease. One of the deadliest arrived in the year 165, the Antonine Plague. It began quietly in the east where Roman soldiers fought in distant lands. Some historians believe it was smallpox. The soldiers carried it home, packed inside their lungs. They returned as hero and spread death to the empire they served. At first, no one understood what was happening. A fever, a rash, a cough. Then entire villages vanished. In Rome, the streets filled with smoke from endless funerals. Temples overflowed with offerings. Families left food outside for spirits, afraid to open their doors. The emperor himself, Marcus Aurelius, watched his armies weaken, his doctors fail, and his people fall one by one. He wrote in his journals about the fragility of life, words that sound soft and human even today. The plague didn't care about power. It didn't see gold, rank, or empire. It moved through breath and touch, treating emperors and slaves the same. In a way, it was the great equalizer. At its peak, The Antonine Plague killed millions, maybe 1 in every 10 people in the empire. Some towns lost almost everyone. The world seemed to stop. Roads turned empty. Fields went untended. The mighty Roman legions, once feared by all, now feared each other. Every cough was a threat, every handshake a risk. And still, humanity endured. Doctors like Galen, one of the greatest physicians of the ancient world, wrote about the sickness. He studied its patterns, recorded its symptoms, and tried to find cures. He boiled herbs, burned incense, and practiced early surgery. He didn't have microscopes or antibiotics, but he had courage, the courage to face the unknown. His book survived long after the empire fell. In his words, we can still feel the heartbeat of early science. The Antonine Plague finally faded, as all plagues do, but it left scars that could not be seen. Trade collapsed, armies shrank, hope dimmed. Some historians believe it was the beginning of Rome's slow decline. The invisible enemy had done what no army could. It cracked the empire from within. A few generations later, when the empire tried to rebuild, another sickness came, the plague of Cyprian. Named after a bishop who wrote about it, this plague spread even faster. People bled from their eyes and mouths. Entire families vanished overnight. In some towns, the dead outnumbered the living. Yet again, the healers stayed behind. Priests, nurses, and volunteers who cared for the dying when no one else would. Cyprian wrote that the plague tested human kindness. Many fled in fear, but those who stayed showed what it meant to be truly human. That compassion, he said, was the only light left in the darkness. As the centuries passed, new patterns began to form. The world was now connected by trade, by travel, by empire. Every step forward made it easier for diseases to spread, but it also made it easier for ideas to move. Knowledge travelled along the same routes as sickness. The plagues brought pain, but they also forced understanding. Humanity began to realise, to survive we had to think beyond ourselves. Doctors learned to separate the sick from the healthy. Cities built aqueducts and public baths. Laws were made to clean streets and bury the dead properly. Every outbreak became a lesson. Every loss became a reason to study harder, to build better, to care more. But deep inside, people still whispered old fears. They still believed sickness might be punishment or curse. They still prayed, burned incense, and looked to the stars for answers. Even when science began to rise, faith never left. Perhaps because both gave comfort in their own way. And somewhere between faith and reason, humanity found balance. We learned that fear could protect us, but compassion could heal us. When the Roman Empire finally crumbled, the knowledge of its doctors and healers scattered across the world. Scrolls travelled east and west, to Persia, to India, to the lands of Islam, where new scholars would read them and build upon them. The light of medicine did not die, it simply moved, waiting for its next chapter. But as that light travelled, so did the darkness. New trade routes opened, ships grew larger, cities expanded again, and in the shadows of that growth the ancient enemy began to stir once more. It would come back stronger than ever, a plague that would sweep across continents and rewrite history in black ink. The world did not yet know its name, but soon everyone would whisper it, the Black Death. For now the old world rested, tired but wiser. Its people had learned that life was fragile, that progress had a price, and that healing was a journey, not a destination. But they had also learned something far more important, that no matter how many times death came knocking, humanity always found a way to answer with hope. Maybe that's what makes our species special. We don't just survive plagues, we grow from them. We carry their lessons in our blood, like quiet memories, reminders that even when the world burns, something beautiful always survives the ashes. The black wind from the east. It began with a whisper carried on the wind. Far away, in the rolling lands of Asia, traders led their caravans along the Silk Road, long ribbon of dust stretching from China to Europe. They carried silk, gold, and spices. But hidden among their goods was something no one could see, something waiting, something alive. It lived in the fur of rats. It rode in the bellies of fleas. It had slept quietly for centuries inside the wild, but the growing web of trade had given it wings. Wherever humans went, it followed. Wherever we built, it found a home, and one day it woke, hungry. The world would later call it the Black Death. But in the beginning it had no name, only fear. It started around the 1330s in the grasslands of Central Asia. There, where mountains met desert, small villages began to vanish. Entire families gone within days. Travellers spoke of black boils, fevers, and death that came faster than breath. Some said it was poison from the sky. Others said it was punishment. But no one truly knew. When merchants packed their wagons and moved west, they carried more than goods. In the dark corners of their carts, rats scurried, fleas clinging to their fur, blood filled with the invisible plague. It was the perfect storm. Humans, animals, and trade, all connected like threads in a web. By the time the sickness reached the Black Sea, it had already devoured towns. Ships waiting in harbours soon became floating coffins. In 1347, a handful of Genoese ships arrived in Europe. They brought with them cargo and death. At first, no one understood. Sailors came ashore with fevers, coughing blood covered in dark swellings under their arms and necks. Within days they were gone. Then the sickness spread to those who had touched them and those who hadn't. It moved faster than any fire. By the time one city closed its gates, the next was already burning with fever. Europe had never seen anything like it. Doctors wore long robes and masks shaped like birds' beaks, stuffed with herbs to block the bad air. Bells rang in every town. Priests walked the streets whispering prayers. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. In some places, there was no one left to bury them at all. The people began to call it the pestilence, the great dying, the Black Death. It was as if the world itself had fallen sick. The plague didn't just kill, it unmade everything humans believed was safe. Families locked themselves inside, villages vanished, trade stopped, fields went untended. Hunger followed death like a shadow. In some cities, half the people were gone. In others, nearly everyone. Still, life tried to continue. Mothers still held their children. Priests still prayed. Gravediggers still worked under the heavy air. Some believed the world was ending. Others thought it was being cleansed. But amid all the pain, there were those who refused to give up, healers who stayed behind to care for the dying. They didn't have medicine. All they had were herbs, cloth, and compassion. But sometimes that was enough to bring peace, even when they couldn't bring cure. The plague spread in waves, across cities, across borders, across oceans. It reached France, Spain, England, then Scandinavia. Even remote mountain villages couldn't hide. It was as if the earth had opened its lungs and exhaled death across the world. No one was safe. Kings died beside peasants, scholars beside servants. Wealth meant nothing. Faith was tested. The Black Death became the great equalizer once again. But inside the horror, something else was happening, a quiet shift in the human mind. People began to see patterns again. They noticed that sickness followed dirt, rats, and crowding. They realized that isolation helped, that clean air mattered. The idea of quarantine, already practiced in small ways before, became official. Ships arriving in Venice were made to wait 40 days before anyone could come ashore. 40 giorni, they called it, 40 days, and from those words quarantine was born. It was a small spark of reason inside a storm of fear, and it worked. Some cities began to survive longer because of it. But the plague was not only a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of the soul. It changed how people saw the world, how they saw life itself. Art turned darker. Songs became sadder. People painted death not as an enemy, but as a companion, the quiet figure who walks beside every living thing. The skeleton with a scythe, the hourglass of sand, these symbols began here, in the shadow of the Black Death. It was humanity's way of understanding what felt impossible. If they could not defeat death, they would give it a face, a story, a shape they could look at and name. And in that strange way, the plague inspired creativity. New poems, paintings, and prayers poured from broken hearts. The world mourned through art. It was grief turned into beauty, a fragile kind of survival. Even as death swept through villages, some people began to rebuild. Fields were empty, but the survivors planted again. Streets were quiet, but they echoed with the footsteps of those who dared to return. Humans, as always, refused to stay silent. The world after the Black Death was smaller, but wiser. Those who survived carried new knowledge in their minds and in their blood. The population had fallen, but wages rose. Workers became valuable. Old systems of power began to shake. Empires and kingdoms changed. In a strange twist, the plague that destroyed so much also planted seeds for renewal. The Middle Ages slowly began to end. The Renaissance, the rebirth, was waiting just beyond the dark horizon. But the Black Death never truly left. It hid in corners of the world, waiting for chances to return. It came back in smaller waves over the next centuries. It haunted ports and cities, reminding humanity that progress never meant safety, only balance. And while people rebuilt their homes, some began to wonder why. Why do plagues come? Why do they return again and again like tides? That question would echo through centuries, and one day lead to microscopes, vaccines, and cures. But for now, the answer was still hidden, locked inside the smallest creatures alive, creatures no one had seen yet. Imagine the quiet after the storm. The air smells of rain and smoke. The world is scarred but alive. A few people stand among the ruins, looking at the sunrise. They don't know it yet, but the future they will build, with science, with art, with compassion, will grow from the lessons of this dark age. The Black Death was the cruel teacher, and humanity its stubborn student. We learned how to fear, we learned how to heal, and most importantly, we learned how to keep going. When historians look back, they call this time one of despair. But if you listen closely, you can also hear something else, a heartbeat, the soft pulse of a world that refused to give up. Even after losing half its people, the earth still bloomed again, because that's what life does. It falls and it rises, over and over endlessly like breath. The Black Death taught us how small we are, but it also taught us how infinite hope can be. The dawn. After darkness. The world woke slowly. After the long winter of death, the air began to warm again. The bells that once tolled for the dying now rang for the living, and in the silence that followed the Black Death, humanity took its first quiet breath of rebirth. Cities stood half empty, fields grew wild, churches echoed with the footsteps of the few who remained. It was a world haunted by memory, but alive. For the survivors, every sunrise felt like a miracle. They had seen what it meant to lose everything, and now even the smallest signs of life, a flower in the dirt, a child's laughter, a bird returning to a tree, felt sacred. No one knew exactly how many had died. Some said 1 in 3, others said half, but numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that humanity still existed, bruised, smaller but breathing. Out of loss, something strange began to happen. The world started to change, and for the first time in centuries, people began to question. They questioned the world, they questioned the heavens, they even questioned themselves. Before the plague, Europe had been built around faith, a single unshakable belief that everything, even suffering, was part of God's plan. But when the plague came and prayers failed, something inside people cracked open. The old answers no longer satisfied the new wounds. "How could this happen?" they whispered. "Why did so many die? Why did the innocent fall with the guilty?" For some, faith grew stronger. For others, it began to fade. And in that space between belief and doubt, curiosity was born. People began to look at the world not just through prayer, but through observation. They noticed things. They wrote them down. They started to wonder how things worked, not only why. The seeds of science began to stir. Doctors who once relied on prayers started keeping record, comparing symptoms, trying to find patterns. In the cities of Italy, scholars studied ancient medical texts and realized they could question them. Knowledge didn't have to stay frozen in the past. It could grow, evolve, and heal. This quiet shift, born from grief, became the beginning of a new age, an age of reason, an age of discovery, an age we now call the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and that's exactly what it was. Out of the ashes of the Black Death, people began to rebuild not just homes but ideas. Artists painted light instead of shadows. Inventors dreamed of machines that could fly. Thinkers studied stars, anatomy, and motion. And everywhere people began to believe again, not only in heaven, but in themselves. Florence became the beating heart of this awakening. Its narrow streets buzzed with painters, architects, and thinkers. Among them was a young man named Leonardo da Vinci, born long after the Black Death, but shaped by the world it had remade. He would grow to become one of the greatest minds in human history, blending art and science in ways the plague generation could never have imagined. But before Leonardo came, there were the silent healers, the forgotten doctors and midwives who carried knowledge through the darkness. They taught that sickness could be studied, that healing was not magic but understanding. Their courage was the bridge between the medieval world and the modern one. Meanwhile, in the small town of Pistoia, Italy, the first public health laws were written. The city made rules about burial, cleanliness, and waste. Simple, practical measures that would save countless lives. This was the birth of something new, public health. For the first time, humanity began to fight disease not with fear, but with organization. And slowly, it worked. Plague outbreaks grew smaller, more contained. Quarantine became routine. Doctors began to recognize that disease had a pattern, that it moved through people, through animals, through air and touch. They didn't yet know about bacteria, but they sensed the invisible connection. The world, once terrified and helpless, was learning. But not everyone welcomed this new way of thinking. The church, still powerful, worried that curiosity might challenge faith. Some thinkers were silenced, others were called heretics. Yet the questions kept spreading, just like the plague had centuries before. Only this time what spread was knowledge. Printing presses were invented, and books poured into the world like rivers of ink. Ideas could now travel faster than disease. A farmer in France could read the thoughts of a scholar in Italy. A student in England could learn from an ancient Greek philosopher. The world was becoming connected, not by trade routes of goods, but by trade routes of thought. It was a new kind of contagion, a good one, the contagion of curiosity. Still, the memory of the plague never faded. It lingered in stories, songs, and superstitions. Children grew up hearing about the years when the air itself seemed deadly. And somewhere deep inside, humanity carried that fear forward, the fear that the invisible could still return. It would, of course. Plagues would rise again, in London, in India, across continents. Each time we would face them with a little more knowledge, a little more courage, but every time the lesson would be the same. Life is fragile, yet unstoppable. As the Renaissance bloomed, so did art. Painters like Giotto, Botticelli and Michelangelo filled walls with beauty, but hidden beneath their colours was the memory of darkness, the knowledge that light is precious because it can vanish, that every breath, every heartbeat, every sunrise is a miracle we can't take for granted. The world once ruled by fear was learning to find beauty in impermanence. The plague had burned humanity, but it also cleared the ground for growth. Old systems of power began to crumble. Peasants demanded fair pay. Merchants grew rich and funded artists. Women stepped into roles once closed to them. The old world had died, and from its bones, the modern one began to rise. It's strange, isn't it? How something so terrible could lead to something so beautiful. How the same world that buried millions could also give birth to Da Vinci's flying machines, to Galileo's telescope, to the idea that the universe itself could be understood. Maybe that's the secret of humanity. We turn pain into progress. We take ashes and make them into art, and yet, deep down, a question still lingered, whispered in the corners of libraries, churches, and dreams. What if it comes again? What if another invisible enemy is waiting? The answer would come centuries later when another wave of plague returned. This time it would meet a different kind of humanity, one that had learned to look closer, to ask deeper questions, to seek truth in the tiniest forms of life. But for now the world was resting. The air was cleaner, the sky felt wider. People danced again in the streets. They sang songs not of mourning but of survival. And maybe, as the sun set over the cities of Europe, someone looked up and thought, "We made it. We lived through the darkness. We are still here." The night came, soft and quiet. The world slept, dreaming of light. And somewhere in that fragile peace the future waited, a future that would hold both new wonders and new plagues. Because that is the story of us, a species always walking the line between life and death, always learning, always beginning one. The great fire and the great fear. The world had healed, or so it thought. Centuries had passed since the Black Death. Europe had grown brighter, louder, more curious. Art filled the walls of cathedrals, ships crossed oceans, cities stretched higher, their streets buzzing with trade and dreams. But beneath all that noise, the old fear still slept, quiet, patient, waiting. It began again in a city called London in the year 1665. A city of 500,000 souls packed tight in narrow streets. Wooden houses leaned over crooked lanes. Children ran through puddles. Rats scurried beneath floorboards, invisible but everywhere. And inside those rats, the old enemy had never died. The plague, silent, ancient and hungry, was coming home. At first it was only whispers. A few people in St. Giles fell ill. Then a few more. Doctors said it might be nothing. But the bells began to ring again, tolling slow and heavy one after another. Each toll meant another life gone, and soon the sound never stopped. Within weeks, the sickness spread across London like fire through dry wood. Houses were sealed shut. Red crosses were painted on doors, symbols of warning, of doom. Inside, families waited, knowing they would never walk outside again. "Lord, have mercy upon us," the sign said. They wrote it in chalk, in fear, in prayer. But mercy did not come. The city changed overnight. Markets emptied, churches filled. The smell of death clung to the air like fog. Doctors walked in long leather coats, faces hidden behind bird-like masks filled with herbs, hoping to block the poison in the air. They looked strange, almost like ghosts themselves. People called them plague doctors. They carried long sticks to touch the sick, to keep distance, to prevent control. But no mask could stop what no one could see. London was trapped. Ships stopped coming. Merchants closed their shops. The The poor, locked in crowded houses, died by the thousands. The rich fled to the countryside, leaving behind the cries of the city, and yet, through all the horror, some stayed. Writers, priests and doctors, the ones who wanted to understand. Among them was Samuel Pepys, a man who kept a diary. He wrote every day about what he saw, the fear, the silence, the courage. Because even in the heart of disaster, someone always keeps record. Someone always remembers. He wrote of carts rumbling through the streets at night, filled with bodies covered in cloth. He wrote of "Bring out your dead" echoing through the alleys. He wrote of how the city smelled of smoke and tears. Still, there were moments of strange beauty. The sky over London was clear, no smoke from trade, no ships on the Thames. The stars could be seen again. The air, for the first time in years, felt clean. Even in sickness, the world found a quiet peace. But then, as summer turned to fall, something unexpected happened. The plague, which had burned so fiercely, began to fade. No one knew why. Maybe it ran out of fuel, too many had died. Maybe the cold slowed the fleas. Maybe luck, maybe fate. And then, just 1 year later, another fire came. But this one was real, not disease, flame, the Great Fire of London, 1666. It began in a bakery. On a quiet September night, a single spark leapt from an oven, caught a wooden wall, and spread. The wind carried it from house to house until the whole city burned. For 4 days London was a sea of fire. The sky glowed orange even at midnight. People ran with buckets, prayers and tears. The same city that had survived plague now faced destruction once more. But here's the strange thing. The fire, terrible as it was, did something the doctors couldn't. It burned away the rats. It burned away the filth. It burned away the plague. By the time the smoke cleared, the disease was gone. Out of ruin, healing again. Out of death, life. The fire destroyed thousands of homes, but it also cleaned the city. When London was rebuilt, the streets were wider, the houses made of stone instead of wood. People learned not just to rebuild walls, but to rebuild smarter. This was how humanity grew, through pain, through loss, through lessons learned the hard way. From the ashes of plague and fire, London became a modern city. Sewers were planned. Clean water was valued. Science, still young, began to ask deeper questions about disease. What if sickness isn't God's punishment? Some wondered. What if it's something natural, something living that can be understood? It would take 2 more centuries to find the answer, but the spark had already been lit. Meanwhile, the memory of the plague never fully left. Children still sang songs about it. Ring-a-ring-a roses, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. A nursery rhyme sweet and playful, but born from death. Even joy carried the shadow of what had once been. As the years rolled on, new diseases came, smallpox, cholera, influenza. Each one reminded humanity that the invisible world still had power. But now people were ready to fight back, not with prayers, but with knowledge. Microscopes were invented. Tiny lenses revealed what no eye could see, a world full of creatures, too small to imagine. Some good, some deadly. And slowly the truth came into focus. Disease wasn't magic. It was life itself, small, hidden, complex. By the 1800s, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch began to uncover the secrets of bacteria. They discovered that sickness came from these invisible invaders, that boiling water, washing hands and clean air could stop them. Simple acts that saved millions. It took centuries, but finally, humanity began to understand the enemy it had feared for so long. The plague was not a curse, it was nature, doing what nature does. And once we saw that, we could fight back. But even as we learned to cure, to heal, to protect, something ancient still stirred in our memory. A whisper that never faded. It could happen again. Because the story of plague is not just history, it's a mirror. Every age faces its own invisible war, a sickness, a crisis, a test. And every time we learn, adapt, survive. London rose again from both disease and flame. Its skyline grew stronger, its people wiser. The city that had once buried thousands now shone with lights, libraries, and laughter. But if you walked its quiet streets at night, you could almost hear the echo, a faint tolling of bells, a whisper from the past, a reminder of what we once endured. And maybe that's what keeps us humble, the knowing that life is never certain, that we live, always, on the edge between breath and silence. The plague taught us many things, how to fear, how to grieve, but also how to rebuild, how to hope. And though centuries passed, the same lessons would one day return, in a world connected not by rats and ships, but by airplanes and screens. The first plague was long gone, but humanity's story with pandemics was only beginning. The invisible world. For most of human history, the smallest things went unseen. People saw trees, stars, oceans, and mountains, but not what lived inside a drop of water or the air they breathed. They could feel sickness, watch it spread, but never see what caused it. The plague had always been a ghost, invisible, mysterious, untouchable. But then, in the 1600s, humanity built a window into another world. It was tiny, made of glass, and it changed everything. That window was the microscope. It began with a man named Anton van Leeuwenhoek, a curious Dutch tradesman. He wasn't a scientist by title, just a man who made lenses for fun. But one day, while polishing a tiny bead of glass, he noticed something strange. The smaller he made the glass, the more detail he could see, and soon he built something no one else had, a tool that could look into the unseen. He placed a drop of pond water under it, peered through, and gasped. There, swimming and twisting, were tiny creatures, millions of them, too small for the naked eye, yet alive, moving, vibrant. He called them animalcules, little animals. No one had ever imagined such a thing. It was like discovering a new planet, only smaller. He wrote letters to the Royal Society of London describing what he saw. Tiny beings in water, in food, even in his own saliva. Life existed in places people thought were empty. The world was far more crowded than anyone had guessed. And suddenly the idea of disease began to shift. If tiny creatures lived everywhere, could some of them be causing sickness? The thought was terrifying, but also full of wonder. For the first time, humanity had eyes to see its oldest enemy. Yet even with Leeuwenhoek's discovery, most people didn't believe it. The idea was too strange, too new. Doctors still talked of bad air, of miasma, of divine punishment. It would take another 200 years before the invisible world became the key to understanding life itself. In the 1800s, another man appeared, Louis Pasteur. He was gentle, careful, and endlessly curious. Where others saw mystery, he saw patterns. He began to wonder why food spoiled, why wine turned sour, why disease spread. He placed broth in glass flasks, sealed some, left others open. The open ones spoiled. The sealed ones stayed clean. And from that simple test, he proved something world-changing. There were living things in the air, unseen, but everywhere. He called them germs. Pasteur's work was like light spilling into a dark room. For centuries, people had blamed sickness on curses, on gods, on the stars. Now they saw it came from nature, tiny, living, real. This was the birth of germ theory. And it changed everything: medicine, sanitation, even modern hope. Pasteur taught people to boil milk, to sterilize instruments, to clean hands. Simple steps, yet they saved countless lives. He created the first vaccines, ways to train the body to fight back. Diseases that once ruled the world began to weaken. A few years later, another scientist, Robert Koch, took the next step. He found the specific bacteria behind anthrax, tuberculosis, and, finally, the plague itself. For the first time in history, humanity could point to its ancient enemy under a microscope and say, "That's it. That's the thing that haunted us." The plague was caused by a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lived in the blood of fleas, which lived on rats, which lived near people. The circle was complete. The mystery was solved. Imagine that moment, thousands of years of fear, explained by a dot under glass. What once felt like a curse was now a chain of life. The invisible world had rules, and if it had rules, we could fight it. Hospitals began to change. Doctors washed their hands before surgery, a simple idea once mocked. Instruments were sterilized with heat, wounds were cleaned, and death rates dropped. It was as if humanity had finally learned to speak the language of the microscopic. Still, the old habits died slowly. Many refused to believe in things they couldn't see. Change came not through one discovery, but through millions of quiet acts. Nurses cleaning beds, mothers boiling water, scientists sharing notes. And in that silence, in those small acts of care, the war against plague began to turn. But the story of the plague was not finished, because even when humanity understood it, it didn't vanish. It simply hid, waiting as it always had. In 1894, the plague returned, this time in Hong Kong. It spread across Asia, carried by ships and trade the same way it had centuries before. But now something was different. Now science was watching. A Swiss doctor named Alexander Yersin travelled to the heart of the outbreak. He worked in a small, dimly lit room filled with sick patients and the sound of coughing. And there, under his microscope, he saw the same thing Koch had described, the small oval bacterium that caused the Black Death. It was named after him, Yersinia pestis. This time the world didn't fall into chaos. Doctors isolated the sick, ships were quarantined, information spread faster than fear, and slowly the plague began to fade once more. Still, it never truly left. Even now, traces of Yersinia pestis remain in the wild, hidden in animal populations, sleeping in deserts and mountains. It's part of our planet's balance, a quiet shadow among the living. But the difference now is understanding. The fear that once ruled us became curiosity, and curiosity became medicine. It's strange to think that something so tiny, a speck smaller than dust, once changed the course of human history. It reshaped cities, faith, art, and science. It forced us to look inward, to ask what life really is. Through the plague, humanity learned its greatest truth, that life is both fragile and fierce, that we are made of the same invisible threads that once tried to end us. And maybe that's why, even after centuries, we still study it. We still look through microscopes and marvel at the dance of cells, the movement of unseen life beneath the glass. Because when we look into that hidden world, we're not just seeing bacteria or disease. We're seeing our reflection, the same drive to survive, to adapt, to keep going. The plague taught us fear. Science taught us wonder. And together they taught us balance. Every heartbeat, every breath, every clean drop of water, it's all part of the same invisible system. Life, protecting life, even against itself. The war between us and the unseen never truly ends. But now we fight it not with crosses and prayers alone, but with microscopes, vaccines and knowledge. And maybe, if you listen closely to that faint hum of life, the buzz of microbes, the swirl of blood cells, the pulse of breath, you'll hear something beautiful, the quiet rhythm of survival. We have come far from the days when bells tolled for the dead, but the memory still lingers soft as a shadow, reminding us that even the smallest thing can change the entire world. The invisible world, once our terror, is now our teacher. The wind carried no warning. It brushed across the tall grass and kissed the faces of men who didn't yet know what was coming. The sun still rose with its same golden warmth. Children still played near the riverbanks, but somewhere far away, something tiny and unseen began to move, something that would forever change the story of life. It began quietly, like all great endings do. A single bite, a single drop of blood, a single moment that went unnoticed. Inside that moment, nature performed one of her oldest tricks. A creature smaller than dust, a bacterium, slipped from one body into another. It carried a secret, one it had learned from centuries of surviving in the shadows. It did not roar or strike with claws. It simply multiplied, slowly, patiently, until the balance between life and death began to tremble. In a small ancient village, long before written history, people began to whisper about strange fevers. They didn't have words like infection or disease. They only had fear. A man would wake in the morning with a burning skin, shivering even under the sun. By night, his breath would fade, and his family would carry him to the edge of the settlement, hoping the spirits would take pity on him. The next day another fell ill, then another. The air seemed cursed. The water tasted strange. No one understood that the sickness did not float in the wind or live in the gods. It lived in the blood of the rats that scurried between their huts, in the fleas that hid inside their fur. And so it spread, quiet as sleep, cruel as hunger. In those days death was not new. People were used to it, from hunger, from battle, from storms. But this was different. This was death that travelled, death that moved from one person to another as if it had grown wings. And for the first time, humans began to notice a terrifying truth. We are all connected. The sickness didn't care if you were a hunter or a farmer, rich or poor, kind or cruel. It reached for everyone with equal hands. Some tried to run into the forests, the hills, the deserts, but the sickness followed, carried by breath, by insects, by touch. There was no border that could hold it. It was the first time humanity realized that their greatest strength, living together, could also be their greatest weakness. At night, the fires burned brighter. People gathered and prayed to the stars, asking what they had done to anger the heavens. They sang songs to keep the fear away. They held one another close as if the warmth of human touch could protect them. But the stars stayed silent, and the sickness went on. Weeks turned to months, villages emptied. The air smelled of smoke and loss. Those who survived buried their loved ones under the same earth that had once fed them. And when the fever finally faded, only silence remained, heavy and sacred, like the pause after thunder. But silence too carries memory. Somewhere deep in their hearts, the survivors learned something they could not yet name, that the world is filled with invisible life, that something unseen can be more powerful than any weapon, and that every breath we take connects us, not just to one another, but to everything alive. This was the dawn of a new kind of fear and a new kind of wisdom. Many centuries later, stories of the first plague became myths. People told of spirits that carried death through the wind, of gods who punished the proud, of curses that fell from the sky. They didn't know it yet, but these stories were the echoes of the first epidemic, the first time life had turned against itself. And still, the tiny enemy never left. It lingered in the shadows, hiding in rats, in soil, in silence. It waited, patient and quiet, for the day humanity would grow close again, for the day cities would rise, markets would open, and trade would bloom, because the plague was not done. It was only sleeping. In the quiet of that ancient world, humanity changed forever. The first plague didn't just take lives. It planted the seed of understanding. It showed us that we are not alone in this world of breathing things. Every heartbeat shares its rhythm with 1,000 unseen creatures, some that help us and some that harm us. But most of all, it taught us humility. For the first time, humans saw themselves not as masters of nature, but as part of it, fragile, temporary, and small beneath the sky. The earth turned, generations passed. Children were born who never knew the sickness, but in their bones the memory of it lingered. A fear of the unseen, a whisper of caution carried through stories and songs. And far away, beneath the soil, in the hidden corners of the wild, the same ancient bacteria slept, waiting for its time to return. The first plague was gone, but its echo would someday shake the world again. Because death, once it learns how to travel, never forgets the road. Shadows in the cities. Cities rose slowly, like forests of stone and wood stretching along rivers and coastlines. They hummed with life, with trade, with ambition. Markets overflowed with food, with cloth, with gold. Children laughed in the streets, unaware of the invisible passengers that followed every step. With humans came animals, rats, pigs, dogs, and wherever there were animals, there were fleas. The fleas carried life too, life so small it could hide in plain sight. And where humans crowded, where homes were stacked close and alleys were narrow, the unseen found the perfect world to thrive. It was in these cities, in the heartbeat of civilization, that the plague learned to travel faster than ever before. It moved with the merchants who bargained in the sun, with the travellers who slept under the stars, with the children who played in the mud. For the first time, disease became a force of history. It shaped the rise and fall of kingdoms. It decided who would survive and who would vanish. It whispered to rulers, reminding them that no crown, no army, no walls could shield against something so small. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, rivers fed life and disease alike. Farmers built canals and cities grew on their banks. And as trade routes stretched from city to city, sickness travelled with grain and livestock, unseen but relentless. The first recorded epidemics began here, in temples and marketplaces, where humans gathered close and breathed the same air. People prayed, offering sacrifices to gods who could not answer. They tried charms and potions, hoping for protection. Some ran to the hills, leaving everything behind, but the sickness followed, patient and silent. It was nature's reminder that life, in all its forms, is a network, a chain, and when one link falters, all feel it. By the time Europe rose from the Dark Ages, the world was no longer quiet. Cities crowded the land. Trade spanned oceans. Ships carried not only goods but rats and fleas and the tiny bacteria that had haunted humanity since the first plagues. The Black Death in the 1300s was just one chapter in a story that had been written for centuries. Yet it left a mark unlike any before. Half of Europe vanished in a few short years. Families disappeared. Fields went untended. Streets became dawdlant. And in the silence, people began to notice something. Life was fragile, fleeting and precious. Fear became part of culture. Songs, stories and art all carried the shadow of death. The plague was no longer just sickness. It was memory. A warning that nature could strike without warning, and that humans, for all their cleverness, were never fully in control. And still humanity adapted. Quarantines were born, cities learned to isolate the sick. Doctors experimented with herbal remedies and protective clothing. Even art began to teach lessons about mortality, about the fleeting nature of life. Every generation carried the knowledge forward. Every wave of sickness became a lesson. And though the plague would strike again, humanity became more resilient. We learned that observation mattered, that small acts of care could save lives, that science was more powerful than superstition. In the alleys of medieval towns, in the castles of kings, in the huts of farmers, life and death danced together. The plague had made no exceptions. It respected neither wealth nor faith. It reminded every human being that we are all connected, all vulnerable, all alive in the same fragile thread. And still, people loved. Still, they married, laughed, prayed and built. Because survival is more than mere breathing. It is the insistence to continue even when shadows follow. By the Renaissance, this lesson had begun to change the world. Art celebrated life and beauty even amid grief. Science began to ask why things happened, not just how to pray for them to stop. And for the first time, humans looked at the plague not as a punishment, but as a puzzle, a problem that could be understood. In universities, scholars studied disease, recording every symptom, every death, every survival. Doctors experimented with hygiene, quarantine and medicine. Slowly, knowledge began to triumph over fear, and yet the plague never vanished entirely. It lurked in the shadows, in rats, in fleas in the soil. It returned again and again, each time testing the progress of civilization, each time reminding humanity of its fragility. The lesson of the cities was simple and eternal. Where people gather, life thrives, and both seen and unseen. Every bustling marketplace, every crowded street, every crowded home is a theatre where survival plays out, tiny and powerful forces shaping human destiny. Even now, in modern cities, the echoes remain. Sewers, sanitation and vaccines have tamed most of the ancient threats. Yet we still remember in stories, in art, in the quiet pulse of our hearts, that something as small as a flea or a bacterium can bend the arc of history. And that memory, carried across generations, is as important as the air we breathe or the water we drink. Because it is in remembering, in understanding, that humanity learned to keep moving forward, even when the shadows never truly leave. Plague across the seas. The world grew bigger. Ships sailed farther, oceans became highways, and trade carried treasures from one continent to another. Spices, silk, gold, and stories all travelled together. But so did something smaller than anyone could see, something that had haunted humanity since its first settlements. The plague travelled with the wind, but also with the waves. It hid in the fur of rats aboard crowded ships. It rode in the blood of fleas, and every port it reached became a stage for history to repeat itself. In the 1500s and 1600s, European explorers reached Africa, the Americas, and Asia. New cities grew at harbours, markets overflowed, and everywhere people crowded together, unaware that they were carrying passengers older than the ships themselves. In some ways, the world was smaller than ever. Messages, goods, and germs travelled faster than anyone had imagined. A sickness that had once taken months to cross Europe could now sail across oceans in weeks. And when the plague arrived in a new city, it spread like wildfire. It was the same invisible enemy, but it had learned new routes, new paths, new ways to reach humans. Villages in the Americas, untouched for centuries, were suddenly exposed to germs from the old world. Entire populations with no immunity were devastated. Death moved silently but swiftly, leaving communities hollowed out. Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas were all connected now, not just by trade and travel, but by shared vulnerability. In the bustling ports of Venice, merchants painted crosses on doors, just as they had in London centuries before. They burned incense to purify the air. They prayed for protection. But the invisible travellers did not respond to prayer. They moved through the city, carried in baskets, barrels, and hidden corners, and the people learned again, slowly, painfully, that closeness brought both life and danger. Every handshake, every shared cup, every crowded tavern carried risk. Yet humans could not stop being human. They still gathered, laughed and traded, and in doing so they repeated the same mistakes of every age. At the same time, knowledge was growing. Doctors recorded patterns. Healers experimented with herbs and remedies. Some cities quarantined ships for 40 days, and the word quarantine was born from that practice. Science and fear began to walk side by side, but the world had changed. Now, it was not only a European problem or an Asian problem. Plague was global. It travelled across oceans faster than armies, carried on wind, water, and human hands, and everywhere it went, it reshaped life. Communities vanished, trade routes faltered, borders and walls were no longer enough to protect anyone. Still, humanity adapted. We learned to map sickness, to track outbreaks, to isolate the sick, and slowly, through trial, observation and courage, we learned that knowledge could be more powerful than fear. Doctors and scientists began to study the patterns of plague. They watched how it moved from rats to fleas to humans. They experimented with isolation, cleaning, and early medicines. Every observation was a step forward, every small success a victory against something that had once seemed unstoppable. Yet even as we learned, the plague never truly vanished. It remained, quiet and patient, in the corners of the world, a shadow of the past, waiting for humans to make mistakes again. By the 1700s, global travel had made one truth clear. No place was untouched. Cities in Asia, Europe, and the Americas shared more than goods and ideas. They shared vulnerability, and the invisible world had become the most powerful traveller of all. Even as humans sailed the seas, discovering new lands and cultures, the plague reminded them that the earth was a connected web. Every action, every journey, every trade could ripple outward in ways no one could see. And yet humans did not stop exploring. They built better ships, better maps, better cities. They studied nature, observing patterns of sickness and survival. Slowly across centuries, knowledge began to grow faster than the plague. But it took patience. It took countless lives, countless losses, countless lessons. And in the quiet aftermath of each outbreak, humanity always asked the same question. How can we live together without inviting the unseen into our homes? That question would guide medicine, science, and public health for centuries to come. It was the question that turned fear into curiosity, grief into innovation, and death into wisdom. Even as the plague crossed oceans, killing without mercy, it left behind a subtle gift, the knowledge that humans could survive, adapt, and rise again. Because every wave of sickness reminded us that life is precious, and every survival reminded us that humanity is stubborn, resilient, and endlessly inventive. From Venice to London, from Africa to the Americas, the lesson was always the same. Even in the face of invisible death, we must continue. We must observe, we must learn, and we must hope. Because the world is larger than fear, and knowledge is stronger than the smallest enemy. Fighting back. By the 1700s, cities had grown taller, streets had grown busier, and the world was moving faster. But wherever people gathered, the old enemy followed, silent, patient, and relentless. Plague was no longer just a visitor, it was a teacher. It forced humans to notice patterns, to watch, to record, to plan. In Europe, some of the first public health systems began to take shape. Officials realized that sickness didn't only happen in homes. It traveled through markets, through rivers, through crowded streets. So they built rules. Quarantine stations appeared at ports. Bodies were buried outside city walls. Fires were burned to cleanse the air. It was a small beginning, but it was hope in action. Meanwhile, science began to stir. Doctors and scholars studied outbreaks carefully. They measured temperatures, noted symptoms, and tried to find patterns in death. It was slow work, painstaking, often ignored by rulers and the rich, but it mattered. Every note, every diary entry, every observation became part of a growing library of knowledge. And medicine began to change. Where once healing had relied on prayers and potions, people started experimenting with cleanliness, fresh air, and isolation. They discovered that hand-washing could save lives, that boiling water and airing rooms helped stop sickness, that tiny actions repeated over and over could build walls stronger than stone against the invisible enemy. In 1796, a turning point came. A doctor named Edward Jenner noticed something remarkable. Milkmaids who had caught cowpox, a mild disease, did not catch smallpox, the deadly scourge of humanity. He experimented carefully, and with hope in his hands, he introduced the world's first vaccine. The idea was revolutionary. It meant that humanity could train its own bodies to resist the invisible world. For centuries, people had reacted to disease, running, hiding, praying. Now they could act ahead of it. They could build shields inside their own blood. By the 1800s, cities were larger than ever, and travel was faster. Steamships and railways carried people, and sometimes germs, across continents. Plague continued to strike in Europe, Asia, and Africa, but now humans had tools, knowledge, and courage to respond. Cholera, typhoid, and plague outbreaks forced governments to improve sanitation. Sewers were built, water was filtered, hospitals became cleaner, and slowly death rates began to fall. The world had learned a lesson written in blood: prevention is stronger than reaction. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century took the fight further. They proved that microbes, invisible organisms, cause disease. They mapped bacteria, experimented with cultures, and discovered that germs could be fought with knowledge, not only with microscopes, vaccines, and better hygiene. Humanity began to push back against centuries of loss. Cities became safer. Families survived where before entire streets had vanished. Even ships were cleaned and quarantined more carefully. And yet, despite progress, plague never disappeared entirely. It lingered in remote villages, in deserts, in rats, in fleas. It waited patiently, like a shadow beneath the sunlight. Outbreaks returned occasionally, testing humanity's new defences, but each time we were stronger. Each time we remembered the lessons of centuries: observe, learn, protect, and survive. Even in triumph there was humility. The invisible world had reminded humans again and again that life is fragile, that sickness can arrive without warning, and that knowledge is the greatest weapon we have. By the late 1800s, the combination of vaccines, quarantine, and public health created a new reality. Death from plague became rare in Europe and the Americas. Knowledge had replaced fear. The world began to believe that humanity could master what had once seemed unstoppable. And yet, the memory of earlier centuries never faded. It lingered in art, in literature, in stories passed from parent to child. Every city street, every bustling market, every crowded port held echoes of those who had once vanished. The plague had shaped humanity as much as any king or war. It had taught empathy, caution, innovation, and resilience. It had forced humans to understand connection, community, and the invisible threads linking all life. Even today, when we walk in clean streets, drink fresh water, or receive vaccines, we are walking in the legacy of those centuries. The lessons learned from suffering, observation, and slow discovery are stitched into the very way we live. We fight invisible enemies not with despair, but with understanding. And still, somewhere in the wild, in rats, in soil, in shadows, Yersinia pestis waits. It is not vengeful. It does not seek cruelty. It simply exists as life does, patient, invisible, eternal. Humanity, however, has learned that it can meet the unseen with courage. It can see it, measure it, understand it. And with knowledge it can survive. Because that is the story of the plague. Not just death, but discovery. Not just fear, but growth. Not just loss, but the unyielding will to live. And so, as the 19th century closed and the 20th began, humanity faced the future wiser, stronger, and ready for the challenges yet to come. Triumph and vigilance, the world had changed. By the 20th century, humans had learned more about disease than any previous generation could have imagined. Germs were no longer invisible ghosts. They were mapped, studied, and understood. Vaccines protected children from deadly diseases, and hospitals became places of healing rather than fear. Yet even in this age of knowledge, the plague had not vanished completely. It lingered quietly in remote corners of the world, mountains, deserts, and forests, waiting for the chance to return. And humans, though wiser, still had to respect the lessons of the past. In 1900, the plague appeared again in Hong Kong. Ships carried it to ports across Asia and beyond. But this time the world was ready. Doctors and scientists identified the bacteria quickly. Quarantines were enforced with care, infected areas were isolated, and the disease, which had once wiped out cities, was brought under control. Or it was a victory born of centuries of learning. From the first whispers of sickness in ancient villages, humanity had slowly built defences, not walls, not prayers, but knowledge. Observation, hygiene, medicine, and science had combined to protect lives. Vaccines spread across continents. Public health systems grew stronger. Education taught people how to avoid disease. Clean water and proper sewage systems saved more lives than any army could. And yet the lessons of humility remained. Even as we mastered some threats, new ones emerged. Influenza, yellow fever, and other deadly pathogens reminded humanity that life is always in motion and that vigilance is never optional. Every outbreak was a reminder that the invisible world could still surprise us. Despite these challenges, humanity began to see itself as capable. Researchers studied patterns, learned from outbreaks, and predicted where disease might appear next. They trained doctors, built laboratories, and shared knowledge across borders. International collaboration became a tool as powerful as medicine itself. The story of the plague became a story of resilience, of humans learning to live with unseen life without surrendering to fear, of progress made one careful step at a time. By mid-century, smallpox, another ancient killer, became the next great test. It had haunted humans for millennia, leaving marks on skin, sorrow in families, and fear in every village. But through vaccination campaigns led by organizations like the World Health Organization, humanity achieved something unprecedented. Smallpox was eradicated. The first human disease ever completely removed from the planet. It was a triumph that seemed impossible centuries earlier. A reminder that understanding nature's rules allows humans to change history. Yet even in triumph, caution was necessary. The plague, like all disease, reminded people that the natural world is complex and patient. Microbes do not act out of malice, they follow their own rules. And humans, though clever, must respect those rules to survive. Every scientist, doctor, nurse, and parent became part of that ongoing effort. Every public health campaign, every vaccine delivered, every clean drop of water, every lesson taught to a child was part of a long story stretching back to the very first plague. It was a story of struggle, but also of hope, of humans learning that even the smallest things could change the course of history, of life persisting even when death seems to hover close. The 20th century saw more outbreaks: plague, influenza, polio, and later HIV. Each one tested humanity's knowledge and patience, and each time people responded not just with fear, but with science, care, and determination. The invisible world, once a terrifying mystery, became a teacher. It forced humans to look closer, to ask questions, to innovate and to collaborate. It showed that survival is not just about strength or numbers, but about understanding and acting wisely. And so, as humanity moved into the new century, the lessons of the first plague remained alive. Life is fragile, connection is powerful, the unseen can shape the world. And knowledge, courage, and compassion are the greatest defences. Every time a doctor examines a patient, every time a scientist studies a germ, every time a community teaches children about hygiene, the memory of those ancient plagues echoes quietly. They remind us of who we are, how far we've come, and how careful we must remain. Even now, as cities glow with lights and people travel across oceans in hours, the invisible world moves alongside us. It tests our systems, our science, and our vigilance. And it teaches quietly and persistently that survival is both a gift and a responsibility. The plague of the past shaped humanity's present. It taught us fear, and it taught us hope. It forced adaptation, innovation, and care. And in every city, every village, every laboratory, the story continues, not just of sickness, but of life, resilience, and the endless human drive to understand and endure. Even centuries later, the first plague whispers its lessons: observe, learn, protect and never forget. Because survival is not just about living, it is about remembering, adapting, and teaching the next generation to respect life, both seen and unseen. The modern battle. The 21st century arrived with cities taller than ever, planes crossing oceans in hours, and technology connecting people across continents. The world seemed smaller, faster, brighter. But even in this new age, the lessons of the first plague remained. The invisible world still existed, quietly moving alongside humans, and humanity had to learn how to live with it, not just fear it. Science had grown stronger than ever before. Vaccines, antibiotics, and antiviral medicines offered protection against diseases that once decimated entire populations. Doctors studied patterns using computers, public health officials tracked outbreaks in real time, and knowledge travelled faster than any pathogen could, giving humans a chance to respond before it spread too far. Yet the invisible world was patient, it adapted, evolved, and sometimes surprised even the smartest minds. The plague, influenza, SARS, and later COVID-19 reminded humanity that no victory was permanent. Even in a world of hospitals and laboratories, tiny creatures could still challenge survival. Global coordination became essential. Countries shared information, scientists collaborated across borders, and organizations like the World Health Organization led campaigns to fight epidemics before they became pandemics. Quarantines, hygiene education, and rapid vaccine development became critical tools, and the same ancient lesson returned. Survival is not about isolation, but understanding and action. Even as humans controlled many diseases, they learned humility. Every outbreak, every new virus, every resistant bacteria reminded people that the world is larger than themselves. And every time scientists studied a new threat, they followed the path of their ancestors: careful observation, experimentation, and communication. The plague, once a terrifying force of nature, became a story to guide modern medicine. Hospitals designed better airflow, water systems were purified, vaccination programs became global, and communities learned the importance of prevention, not just treatment. Children in schools learned about germs and hygiene. Doctors wore protective equipment. Airplanes screened passengers. Laboratories mapped genomes, tracking pathogens in ways no one could imagine centuries before. Yet despite all progress, the invisible world reminded humans of its presence. New diseases appeared. Old ones re-emerged in remote areas. Climate change, travel, and urbanization created new opportunities for microbes to spread. And humans, for all their knowledge, had to remain vigilant. The story of the first plague was no longer just about death. It was about preparation, curiosity, and the persistence of life. It was about understanding that humans are part of a larger system, where every action, washing hands, vaccinating children, monitoring outbreaks, can shape survival. In this era, science became a shield, and knowledge became a sword. Humanity no longer had to rely on fear or superstition. Every discovery built on centuries of observation and courage. From Leeuwenhoek's first microscopes to Pasteur and Koch's germ theories, from Jenner's vaccines to modern genomic tracking, the chain of learning stretched across time, and yet humility remained central. Because the world had taught humans that life is fragile, and the smallest organisms can influence entire societies. The invisible world demanded respect, and humans had finally learned to combine that respect with action, turning vulnerability into protection. The 21st century also revealed the power of communication. News, social media, and international reports allowed outbreaks to be contained faster than ever. Communities could respond, governments could act, and scientists could develop solutions quickly. But the underlying truth remained the same. The plague taught that survival depends on both observation and cooperation. Even today, in every clean street, every vaccine, every hospital bed, the lessons of the first plague echo quietly. They remind humanity that life is fragile. They remind us that the unseen shapes the seen, and they remind us that knowledge, courage, and care are our greatest defences. The modern battle against disease is ongoing. Every day microbes adapt. Humans adapt faster. Each generation builds on the wisdom of those who came before. And the story of the first plague, whispered across centuries, continues to guide humanity toward balance, between life and death, between fear and an understanding, between the visible and invisible worlds. Because in the end, survival is not just about fighting the smallest enemies. It is about learning from them, respecting them, and using that knowledge to protect life, everywhere, for everyone, for generations to come. The plague taught humans the rhythm of caution. Modern science taught them the power of foresight, and together they created a world where humanity could endure, even in the face of the unseen. Even now, somewhere beneath the soil, in the wild, in hidden places, Yersinia pestis sleeps. And yet humans continue to live, to explore, to connect and to thrive, because knowledge is stronger than fear, and hope is stronger than any shadow. Shadows in the wild. Even as cities grew taller and science grew stronger, the world outside remained vast and untamed. Forests, deserts, mountains, and grasslands held life that humans could barely see. Rats burrowed in quiet corners, fleas scuttled along the soil, and bacteria slept in shadows, waiting, patient as ever. The plague never disappeared completely. It simply shifted its home. For every human victory, the bacteria found refuge in nature. Remote villages, untamed wilderness, and wild animals became hosts. It was a reminder that humans do not own the earth. We live alongside life that is older, stranger, and more resilient than we often imagine. Scientists learned to watch these hidden worlds carefully. They studied rodents in Mongolia, prairie dogs in the United States, and marmots in China. They mapped where plague bacteria slept, waiting to emerge. They tested soil, fleas, and animal populations, learning the rhythms of nature. And slowly, humanity learned that observation is as important as action. Because the plague had always been a teacher, not just a killer. It taught humans to respect the unseen, to understand connections, and to act before disaster struck. Modern surveillance became a shield, allowing communities to prepare rather than panic. Even today, cases of plague appear in remote regions. They are rare, controlled and treatable, but they remind humans of the fragile balance of life. Every outbreak is a message. The world is alive with forces beyond our senses, and to survive we must observe, respect and adapt. Humans no longer cowered in fear. Instead, they studied patterns, tracked bacteria, and created systems of care. Vaccines and antibiotics became weapons, and knowledge became armour. Yet humility remained central. Nature cannot be conquered, only understood. In the wild, life continues its quiet rhythm. Predators hunt, prey hides, and tiny organisms weave through soil, air and water. The plague bacteria live among them, silent and patient. And humans, for the first time in history, can watch without being helpless. They can predict outbreaks, respond quickly, and protect communities. The world is still connected. Every human action, every change in the environment, every shift in wildlife affects the balance. And scientists realize that protecting humans means protecting the wild. Ecosystems are intertwined, and the health of one impacts the health of all. This understanding shaped modern conservation and public health. By studying the wild, humans learned how to prevent outbreaks. By respecting habitats, monitoring populations, and tracking bacteria, they reduced risks. The invisible world remained ever present, but humans were no longer defenseless. And yet the story of the plague continued to teach patience. It reminded us that life is persistent, resilient, and unpredictable. That even the smallest organism can shape the fate of cities, countries, and generations, and that survival is not about domination, but about balance. In schools, children learned about germs and hygiene. In laboratories, scientists mapped DNA and tracked pathogens. In homes, parents taught hand washing and vaccination. And in every corner of the planet, humanity applied the lessons passed down for centuries. The first plague had entered human history like a shadow. It haunted villages, cities, and continents. It reshaped human behaviour, culture, and science. And in doing so, it left a gift: the knowledge that life is connected, fragile, and beautiful. Even in the 21st century, humanity continues to face microbial challenges, but the difference is profound. Where once fear ruled, knowledge now guides action. Where once the invisible world was a terror, it is now a teacher. And every scientist, every doctor, every informed citizen becomes part of the ongoing story. The plague still exists, waiting quietly in the wild. But humanity has learned to live with it, to rescend it, and to use knowledge to protect life. We are no longer helpless observers. We are students of a lesson written over millennia. Survival requires awareness, care, and cooperation. And so, as humans look out over forests, deserts, mountains, and cities, they see not just life but connection. The invisible world moves around them, shaping history in subtle, persistent ways. And they remember the first plague, the ancient battles, the lessons of fear, observation, and adaptation. It is a story of patience, courage, and resilience, a reminder that humans are part of a larger world, fragile yet enduring. The story of the first plague does not end with a single village, and in that understanding, life persists, or a single century, quietly, beautifully, and with across time, following humanity as we learned, fell, and rose again. From ancient huts to modern skyscrapers, from the first fevers in small communities to global pandemics, the lessons have been constant. Life is fragile, invisible worlds are powerful, and knowledge is our greatest shield. Even now, centuries later, the echo of the first plague is present in every hand wash, every vaccine, and every public health campaign. It whispers in the corridors of hospitals and in the quiet work of scientists. It lives in history books, stories, and memories, reminding humans that we are part of a larger, interconnected world. The tiny organisms that once terrified entire civilizations have become teachers, urging awareness, respect, and humility. Through time, humans learned to fight with understanding rather than fear. We observed patterns, recorded data, and shared knowledge across communities and borders. Quarantines, hygiene, vaccines, and antibiotics became tools passed down through generations. Every generation added its discoveries to the chain of knowledge, building defences stronger than any walls or armies. The invisible world still exists, as patient and resilient as ever. Plague bacteria sleep in wild rodents, fleas, and soil. New microbes will always emerge, and humanity, though wiser, must remain humble and vigilant. This is the gift of the first plague. It taught that survival is not a guarantee, but a careful balance of learning, adapting, and respecting life. The first plague shaped culture, science, and human imagination. Stories of fear became stories of caution. Songs and art carried lessons about mortality and resilience. Communities rebuilt after devastation, stronger and more connected. And over time, the shadows of death inspired curiosity, compassion, and innovation. Humans discovered that we could coexist with life in all its forms, even the smallest and most dangerous. We learned that understanding brings safety, that observation leads to prevention, and that connection to nature, to community, to the unseen is the key to survival. Today, humans face new challenges, emerging diseases, climate change, and ecological disruption. The lessons of the first plague remain crucial. They remind us that life is fragile, that our choices ripple outward and more, and that cooperation and knowledge are our most powerful tools. Even in cities buzzing with electricity and air travel, even in laboratories studying day and germs, the ancient rhythm continues: observation, adaptation, and care. Science is our guide and humility is our companion. We honour the memory of every life lost and every lesson learned by applying knowledge with vigilance and compassion. The first plague was more than disease. It was a teacher, a mirror, and a reminder of what it means to be human. It showed us our vulnerability and our resilience, our fear and our hope, our mortality and our capacity for wisdom. Generations of humans learned to survive, to care for one another, and to act with foresight. We built cities, medicine, and global systems to prevent the devastation that once seemed inevitable. And yet we never forget. The invisible world is patient, persistent, and ever-present. The story of humanity's first plague ends not with fear, but with understanding. It ends with quiet respect for life, seen and unseen. It ends with hope, because humans have learned that survival is possible through knowledge, courage, and connection.